learning or just hard memorization. And it's a topic that is really under hot demand because a lot of people have problems with rote learning and memorization, and they think that that's the main issue. But what you'll find when you go through the course is that you're probably over dependent on rote learning. And a lot of students think, well, there's no other way to actually learn this. But I've extremely rarely found that to be true. In almost all situations, especially in easier content, for example, high school level or early university level, there is not a lot of information that needs to be rote learned. So for the university level, maybe around about 20-30% of the information ends up being rote learned. Whereas at the high school level, only around maybe 10% of the information actually needs to be rote learned. And common feedback is that students are very surprised once they learn these other approaches of learning, how much rote learning they don't need to do. In fact, some students actually start getting insecure because they're not rote learning as much and they're so used to rote learning. But it just means that this technique is just that powerful. However, rote learning is necessary. However, it should be used as a last resort. You shouldn't be depending on rote learning to learn everything. You should be relying on these other types of techniques. However, I understand that as it is now, statistically speaking, the chances are you listening right now have a significant proportion of your learning through rote learning. Therefore, I'm going to teach you how to do it a little bit better so that when we teach you the later techniques, it's a little bit less stressful to swap these things out because you're not stressed so much and bogged down by the burden of having to rote learn so much. In the meantime, I do expect that you're going to have to rote learn a lot less as you learn other techniques throughout the course. However, appreciating that you do have a lot of rote learning, probably as part of your study system right now, I'll teach you some techniques about it. And one of the first techniques I'm going to teach you is the idea of basic association. And basic association is quite a simple thing to understand. It says that you can take something that you're trying to rote learn and you can associate that with something else. And then if that something else in itself is more memorable, you can create this association between them. So here's an example. Let's say that you need to remember that a certain type of pigment is red in color when exposed to UV light. So instead of memorizing that and just saying this pigment is red under UV light exposure, you may think of something that's red. Okay, what do you think of that's red? For me, I might think of a Porsche, a red Porsche. And then the next thing I'll think of is UV light. Well, what do I think of when I think of UV light? Well, I might think of sunlight. And so in that case, I might imagine a Porsche, a red Porsche under the baking hot sun. And I have to remember, baking hot sun, maybe in a desert, maybe the car is melting. Can you imagine that? And when you imagine that, now it's easier to associate that with thinking, okay, I remember this idea of like a melting red car under the baking hot sun in a desert. So what does that mean? Right, sun, UV light, red car, red pigment. And then you can remember there's a certain pigment that's red when exposed to UV light. So that's how basic association works, is you take a certain idea and you find a type of memorable imagery, often something that's a little bit absurd, something that is a bit crazy. You don't want to think red pigment, oh, I'm going to imagine a red pigment. Under a UV light, oh, I'm going to imagine UV light spectrum. That's just not memorable enough. You need to think of something that's a little bit outside of the ordinary, something that if you were to see that in real life, that would make you stop and stare because it's so crazy and out of this world. Think of something that's a little bit absurd and then associate a type of imagery to it. And you can use this for individual facts, you can use this for lists, you can use this for numbers even, by associating certain numbers with certain types of imagery. So for example, you might think of the number 2 and the way that it looks and think, oh, that looks kind of like a swan. And so you might think of a swan when you think of the number 2. And you might think there are 2 molecules of certain type of gas. Well, you might think of that type of gas, and if let's say it's sulfur gas. Sulfur gas smells like rotten eggs. So you might imagine a swan, that's carrying rotten eggs, or a rotting swan, or a really stinky swan, or a swan inside a giant rotting egg, or a swan inside a swamp that's just like got all this, bubbly geothermal activity. You can think of stuff like that, right? And all of this is very memorable. And you can actually draw these images into a notebook or mind map or on flashcards, and you can use that to make your memorization a little bit easier instead of just using words. Because remember, words are not very well processed. Our brain is honestly not very good at handling words, much worse than it is at handling images and visual information and imagery. So we want to leverage off that imagery as much as possible. And that's the idea of basic association, is that we're associating something which is quite a specific fact to something else like imagery or some kind of crazy other thing. And we're actually going to take that and we're going to build on it much later and see how we can integrate that into another system. But for now, give that a go and you'll find that it's pretty fun and enjoyable and quite effective. Also, I'm sure you can still remember the swan and the rotting swamp, and I'm sure you can still remember the melting red Porsche under the sun. And when this video finishes, I'm sure you're going to remember exactly what those two things stood for as well. So that just goes to show, even without trying to remember it, you remembered it. That's the power of basic association. Other two little things is to use active recall. And I've been talking about active recall before, but if you don't know, active recall just means to not read something and then just say it again, or not just read it and then think, oh yeah, I understand this, because that's actually what's called recognition-based learning. Recognition means that if I show you this pen, you know that this is a pen, whereas recall means that you'd be able to draw the picture of that pen and know exactly what it looks like without having to look at it again. What you need is recall, because you're tested on recall. Recognition is not really going to get you anywhere, so you want to make sure that you're revising through active recall. The active part of active recall is the bit that people get quite misaligned on, because I think that any type of recall is active. The active is really talking about how much it activates your brain. So active recall in terms of problem solving without referring to the information, making mind maps, or teaching based on your memory, that is much more activating than, for example, just reading something, closing it, and writing it down again. Because that relies on only your short-term memory of that individual discrete thing. And if you're going to be using active recall, it's better to, number one, have a long delay between the time you saw it and the time you need to recall it, usually at least around 1 or 2 days. And it's also better if you're able to recall it in a way that's different to how you remembered it. So for example, if you remember the facts, try to apply it to solve a problem based on recall from memory without looking at your notes. So those are ways that you can optimize active recall. Now, I do talk about how active recall is not that great. It is good, it's just not something that you should over-rely on, because it is still about optimizing your memorization. And the approaches we're going to talk about, you will start seeing that they just veer away from memorization altogether and it becomes less necessary. And then the final thing is the idea of using something to help you with spaced repetition. With the study scheduling that I've already given you, you've already got expanding gap-spaced repetition in there. But the other thing that you can do is use digital flashcards. And I say digital because digital flashcards is superior to physical flashcards for a multitude of reasons. It's an incomparable. I find people that recommend physical flashcards laughable and how little they know about the neuropsychology of learning. It's just an atrocious idea. I would never recommend you use physical flashcards. And we're going to go into this a lot more in depth and explain why later on. But just for now, trust me, you definitely want to use digital flashcards. Least of all because digital flashcards have a spaced repetition algorithm built into it. And if you use a flashcard app that's anything that's worth its space on your phone, it will have the latener system built in by default or as a setting you can activate. So if you're unsure, just ask the developers or just Google it and see if the app supports that setting. Go into the settings and have a look if you can activate the latener system for spaced repetition. And as long as you're following that, you should be able to find the spaced repetition a little bit more manageable. It's actually better not to do it in batches. So a lot of people will say, oh, Saturday is my flashcard day. I'll spend 5 hours doing flashcards. Or some people spend 5 hours a day doing flashcards, which is a whole other problem altogether, which again, we will talk about later. And right now, we're just not quite at the level where we can solve that. But a way to get over that is to just make sure that whatever flashcards you're using, you're trying to use basic association when you can, to make it more memorable so that your ability to clear things is expedited. You're using all the other techniques I told you about in terms of in-class and pre-study and study scheduling. That's going to allow you to retain things a little bit more easily and have less flashcards that you need and clear them more easily as well. And just manage that load. And again, don't stack them all together because it means that you have an overwhelming amount of flashcards to do in one day. It's very daunting. It's actually better to do them every now and again, here and there throughout the day. For example, when you're on the toilet, what else are you going to do? Pull out some flashcards, do 3, 4, 5 flashcards. I don't know how many times you go to the toilet per day, but you can get a few flashcards done just on the bus, waiting for a friend, walking somewhere. These little moments and pockets of time that you can be utilizing, those are actually really effective times to use flashcards. It's actually more effective psychologically speaking than doing it in batch. And that's something called micro-learning, which again, we will talk about and how you can systemize a process based on that later in the course as well. But for now, just a few guidelines in terms of using basic association when you can, using active recall and optimizing the type of active recall that you're doing so it's more activating and a little bit more challenging and applying the information differently, and using spaced repetition not only through your study scheduling but also through digital flashcards with expanding gap spaced repetition with a Leitner system, and a few tips on how to make sure that you're handling and managing your flashcards until the point comes where you don't even need to rely on most of them because your other approach to learning is more effective, which again, we will learn throughout the course. So remember, if it's overwhelming to do all of this at once, just do what you're comfortable with. Start small, baby steps. If it doesn't work, give it another go, try to experiment, change a few things, try to make it work for you. If it still doesn't work, you let us know, we help you. And then as you progress through the course, you get better and better and better. You work, we work, everything works. But it has to start from you diligently applying some of these and building that momentum, which I think you've heard me say in every single one of these lessons if you've been going in chronological order of the, what's on the page. But that's how important it is to just build that momentum. Don't dawdle, don't just sit on your hands and just don't do anything about it. Really get in there, start from tonight, start using these things, make a plan for yourself and really follow that schedule and make sure that you're just kicking off the first few weeks strong, and you'll find that your results a month, 2 down the line, you'll thank yourself for it.